Hi, and welcome to the Hytro Performance Podcast, where we speak all things performance and BFR. I'm joined again this week by Dr. Tom Brownlee, who is our Chief Science Officer.
Hi.
And down the line, the infamous Joe Truman, GB cyclist. Hey, Joe.
How's it going, guys?
Thank you so much for making the time. I know it's busy time in your competition calendar. So for those that don't already know you, can you do a little bit of an intro, give us a bit of background on both yourself as an athlete, but also maybe as a scientist as well?
Yeah, so I'm a GB track cyclist. I've been up in Manchester now training for the last 10 years with the British squad. Off to the World Champs next 2 weeks' time in Santiago, Chile. So still going well career-wise. But I've also started doing I'm now working on a university degree in sports science. So got a really good, really like broad interest in Hytro and how it helps performance. And yeah, so it's great to chat with you guys.
Now, we're going to get into more detail about it later, I think. But given how long you've been competing at the highest level, would you say that your approach to training has changed? Have you got sharper? Are you trying more things? How does it work?
It's definitely more. So 10 years ago, I think my volume was a lot higher. That's one thing. And I'd train a lot of volume for like quite a niche thing, which is like P3 in the team sprint. I would do load of training every week, all for P3. And it was very much just down that one road. And more recently, I've kind of broadened my horizons a little bit by trying to be smart with training and move more towards some shorter disciplines and some longer disciplines, still within track sprint cycling. But now working within like 17 seconds as an event up to about a minute. And I think, yeah, going from very, very niche, just P3, just a 43-second effort, and now trying to open it up, it's been really, really interesting sort of challenge for me. I think I learned a lot on the way as well.
For those people in the audience not aware of the different types of disciplines, like what type of cyclist are you? So then what kind of difference is that for you as an athlete?
So I'm a track cyclist, so it's a power sport. It's all about peak power up to like 1 minute anaerobic power, basically what we can get out in that 1 minute. And in cycling, what's really cool about cycling, it's so multifaceted about in terms of like the distance and the disciplines you can have. You can have sprinters like myself down to 17 seconds as an event, all the way up to Grand Tour riders doing hundreds of kilometers in a day, and sort of anywhere in between. Lots of different cycling events sit on that continuum. So you've even got endurance on the track, sprint on the track. You've got single one-day classics on the road. You've got multi-day Grand Tours. So it really is a huge, broad spectrum of physiology within cycling, which is really cool.
Joe, can I just ask for a bit more context? You mentioned that historically you've done quite a lot of volume. Is that sort of relative to your duration, or is it just like absolute volume has been pretty high?
I say, well, when we talk about volume, it's a little different to the road guys because they may go and do 4 hours most days, zone 2, dipping into some intervals. Where for us it would be high volume day would be 2 hours in the gym in the morning, followed by like a 4-hour track session. And that track session, obviously, we're not riding the whole time, but it's like we may have like up to 8 30-second efforts, for example, and it's repeated sprint. So for us, that is what a lot of volume means. But having said that, we do still tap into that sort of road riding philosophy in terms of base miles and a lot of aerobic work. But yeah, so back in the day, I was definitely doing a lot more volume. And I think that came from a place of like training more is better. And as a sprinter, I've come to realize more and more that if you're not able to perform or if you're not able to commit to those efforts like 100%, like with full intent, you're not going to be getting as much as you can from them. Whereas the road guys, they can kind of do hours and hours of zone 2 and they can dip into slightly higher zones and they're still going to, even on your worst day, you can sit at zone 2 for a while. Like for me, like on a terrible day where I'm knackered, I'm not going to be anywhere near my peak power. So what I'm essentially training there is to be good repeatedly at a power that I'm not going to race at. So I think something that's changed a lot is, quality over quantity, I guess.
And I think that's amazing insight for people that some people might think that athletes at your level are sort of training perfectly, and you're showing that there are still quite big refinements to be made there. That's a pretty big change, isn't it? And I wonder, like, how have you felt the results have been from that quite drastic change? Is it freshness? Are PBs going up in the gym or on the track? Like, what's it done for you?
Yeah, I've definitely got quicker from it. But then I can't say that, the previous high volume wasn't important either, because maybe like something I think now is maybe early career, lots of volume, give yourself a lot of headroom and a high ceiling to use, and then later in your career you can kind of tap into different areas of that. But I found myself a lot sharper and a lot more able to commit to efforts, basically. And I think now, if you're able to commit multiple times in a week at absolutely peak intent and like max effort, that plays into, for me as a sprinter, so much better, because when I'm racing, that's how I'm aiming to be, fully fresh and tapered. So yeah, I think you need both. You obviously need some volume as well, but I think I'm learning more and more about recovering between sessions to a point where you can commit fully is super important. I remember a little bit when I was first on the squad, like when I was about 18, our coach said something like, "There's no such thing as overtraining, just under eating and under sleeping," and we kind of always laughed about it after, because it was a little bit stupid, but I think there was a lot to that. And I think more recently I've then began to kind of push the envelope on recovery more with different modalities and different techniques and bits of technology and things like that.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why we as a company and a team of people love talking to you, because you have quite a unique point of view. We talk about Hytro and BFR operating at the intersection of sport and science. So it's interesting to go back to your question, Tom. Do you think that this knowledge and smart decision to change things like volume comes from doing it for 10 years, or from your quite, I think, unique athlete understanding of the science as well? Because you are studying alongside this, and you are looking into actually what's happening, not just the athlete that turns up to the gym and say, how many reps at what level, let's go. I know that you ask questions on why, and I know that you potentially change your training plans based on what you understand and what you want to try out. So do you think it comes from experience, or do you think it comes from learning?
I think it comes from I think it comes from both, but you need to have the experience to kind of trust yourself to make those decisions. But I do think, like, one thing I've learned, I think, through studying is, like, I always used to be told and kind of led to believe that you can only really train one thing at one time. So, like, one point of a season, there's only point working on hypertrophy or strength. Like, let's just do this for a few months. Then we'll just completely transition into lactate threshold, or then we'll completely go into something else. And then 3 weeks to go, we'll start looking at peak power. Whereas I think something I've realized through learning is, if you're clever with how you plan a week and you do your recovery around it, you can hit both. So I've started hitting like high, like real peak power, snappy stuff at the start of the week, almost having looking at Wednesday as like a big recovery day, where like the goal of that day is recovery. Thursday, Friday, and then looking at sort of hitting high volume, and then I've got the weekend to recover, ready for the Monday again. And I think when you actually plan a week like that, you can kind of break it down and hit multiple things at once, where previously I think traditional track sprinting, or not just sprinting, just track, would be like a long off season of aerobic work. Then you can go into massive hypertrophy and strength block. Then you're going to be moving into like a lactic tolerance block. Then you're moving into a peak power block. And to me, that didn't really make sense, because it takes you a while to kind of start to make those gains. And I just started to mix them, and that was really through learning and seeing how some other sports do things. I say it's both, but I think learning is definitely important. I think investing in yourself and looking at, so I kind of look at my career now as a lot of different kind of experiments, or like myself as like a case study, I guess. And I found that really interesting.
I was just going to mention your self-experimentation, Joe. I think you're kind of a unique guinea pig of sorts. And I think in my previous life of working with elite athletes, it sometimes frustrated me a little bit when they would say, "Oh, I know my body. I know what I should be doing today." And I've come to believe that on the whole often is the case. And certainly for someone like yourself, who is a bit of a self-experimenter and works in quite a closed sport where there are quite few variables to change, I suppose, and you really do notice those differences. And I think it speaks to the sort of individualization of athletes generally. And you talk about there's no such thing as overtraining, and I think in the ability to tolerate load is super individual. Some people you can just keep on giving work to, and they can just take it. Some people just look at the gym and they break. And I think crucially for you, you probably know you better than anyone about how you can play around with those variables, and you're probably reaping the rewards from that understanding. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. And there's also, you say about how track cycling there's not that many variables, but something I've tried to play around with a lot is like in terms of like, because like we are just going around in the circle, and it's like you could just sort of look at that as, but then there are things you can change by like gearing, for example. So something I've done recently is, or a couple of years ago, started like massively playing around with gearing. So going like, we might vary the gear by 20%. Like you might go to the top of that for a strength session, and you go towards the bottom of that for like a power speed session. But I was thinking, why are we only pushing it 20%? You can push it a lot more than that. And are you going to get more benefits from that? So I sort of almost doubled the gear I would use. So you're pedaling at half the speed as you would like a massive on-bike strength stimulus, just a bit of an experiment, and it worked really well. So I think it's track cycling in one way is kind of, it's quite, closed, and we're not out in the elements and things, but there are quite, when we do change something, you can kind of instantly see an impact because it is controllable, which is cool. I am
gonna get to some VFR questions in a minute, but this is really interesting. So I think you have a arguably tougher job training for competitions, right? Traditional team sports, there's a game every weekend, and you don't need to plan when your recovery period is, because you have to have at least a day before that game. Whereas you have, in some instances, it's great because you have a longer adaptation period, but then there's more areas where you could get it wrong then, or more. It's too late. You've done all these months, and your competition's coming, and we can't make the adaptation now. So does that force you and to be more aware of what you're doing? Do you see other cyclists, testing on themselves and trying things, or what does success look like?
Something we've started doing a lot more of is like monitoring, because I think we realized that you could go 6 months without racing. To be honest, at the start of my career, we'd race for like 2 months of the year, we'd have races in, and 10 months of the year we'd be just training. And like, firstly, for motivation, that's a bit hard because you're looking so far ahead, and like when you're absolutely knackered and you're in Manchester and you haven't seen sunlight because you're forced to ride into track every day, not allowed to drive. And then so that's tricky. And we started doing monitoring, where almost like a weekly check-in, where we do 6-second power test or 30-second Wingate test. And that kind of acts like a little, firstly, like a tracking of fatigue, but also like we can track kind of progress and things like that. So I think when we started implementing that's really useful. But it also, I kind of like the idea that, well, not the idea, the fact that you have 10 months of the year where you don't race, because it really allows you to get stuck into things that you want to work on. So I think I spent like the first 4 years of my career, like 10 months of the year was just like trying to get stronger. And I think I got to the point where like I probably could have got stronger, but unless that became the sole focus and that was it, without any track riding, I was like tapped out of my strength really. And then we began to start looking at other things and started making progress there as well. So I think it's a blessing and a curse, because one allows you to really focus and hone in on what you need to work on, but another time motivation suffers a little bit when you haven't got a race coming up. And also just, you kind of forget, when you spend that long in training without racing, you kind of forget what it feels to race and how it feels to be snappy and sharp. And thankfully, as you sort of progress, as I've progressed through my career, I've like been exposed to more and more race opportunities, so that doesn't happen so much anymore. But then you end up thinking, I've been racing for the last 6 months, I'd love to just get stuck into a big training block again. So there's definitely benefits to both sides of it.
I'm an out-and-out team sport guy. Grew up and been around it and worked in team sport so long, and my appreciation, the longer I've now spent away from it, with even team sports, but like individual athlete efforts, the appreciation of how mentally tough you have to be in your training blocks and in competition, because guess what? There's no one else there if you're lagging behind. There's no one like doing the extra pedaling or taking someone out. There's tactics, but it's not the same. I want to go back to when you said that you kind of feel like you maybe maxed out on your strength and then started to have to look at other things. Is that where you kind of first looked at like when did you first start using BFR? Were you introduced to it?
So I had back surgery in 2019, 2020. And my physio basically suggested starting with BFR as just a way to like mitigate my lean mass losses, basically. And at first, I was a bit skeptical because I thought it was like a confidence thing. Like, you know, you can do this 30 reps times 3, and that'll keep all of it mass. Well, they never said it would keep everything, but they said it would help. And then after a few months, I realized it generally really worked. And it basically became part of my gym plan. Any block where I was in a strength or hypertrophy phase, that was like a stalwart in my gym plan, I guess. A fairly simple protocol. I'll just be 3 sets of 30. 30, 15, 15, 15. Leg extension or Bulgarian. So that really sort of started my journey of BFR. And then it was kind of just part of my plan. And I looked into a bit of research. I came across a bit of research, and I saw about how it could help recovery as well. And that was where I first came across Hytro. And it was a bit counterintuitive because the thing that's like causes you so much pain in the gym could suddenly apparently help you recover. So I didn't really try recovery like at first, and then I began to think, as I was saying earlier, like trying to split the week and really recover midweek. So I started looking at Hytro and BFR for recovery. And that really set me on the path of seeing it as a really useful part of my training, really.
If I can break that down sort of bit by bit then, Joe, if that's okay. So you mentioned that you started using BFR in rehab, which is often the sort of gateway drug for BFR for people that gets them hooked. Who was it who introduced you to that, and what did that protocol look like roughly?
Hannah Crowley. So it was our sports rehab therapist. It started with, I think 30, 15, 15, 15, like standard protocol for BFR, leg extension, because at first I wasn't loading my back at all. And that progressed on to moving to Bulgarians, moving into then like walking lunges, things like more and more like a normal gym plan, basically. And then when I came back to like full training again, well, I'd not back to back squatting, but everything else. It then just became like an accessory exercise at the end of the session.
Out of interest, why would you include that? Like, what made you think, oh, I'm going to keep on doing this? Because presumably you reduced the load that you used and you strapped on and you did the exercises. Why did you think that you would rather do that than just doing it traditionally out of interest?
I think it started probably with habit, because it was just something that was part of my gym. And even when I started training in the gym more, usually it wasn't quite like 95% 1RM back squat. It was still kind of, so I kind of kept it in, I think, as a bit of a fail safe. But then I genuinely realized, I think it was slightly to do with researching it, and I think more and more of us adopted it. And I realized I could get a lot of volume in, and I wouldn't be necessarily as tired for the track session later on that day. So if I was doing leg extension, instead of doing 150 kilos, I might only down at 60, similar amount of reps, but it hurts a lot more. But later that day, I'm not as fatigued on the track. And when I'm aiming for quality on the track after a 2.5-hour gym session, I think that was kind of like a welcome addition, really.
And then to finish that story, I suppose you then mentioned that you were using it as part of your recovery, which is obviously really important for you with the training volume that you're doing, and I suppose in competition as well, where you have multiple rounds in relatively short succession. So what did that look like when you started using it for recovery, and has it changed? What does it look like now? And is that different for training or competition? Sorry, that's loads of questions. Shall I split that?
Yes. The start of my use of BFR for recovery was basically because on rest days, sometimes I just felt like I knew I needed to do some sort of recovery or active recovery. Usually I couldn't be bothered. I was just knackered. So I was like, if you can do something which doesn't involve much, you don't need to drive to the track to get the Normatec boots. You don't need to get kitted up to go out for a spin. You can literally lay on the sofa, watch Netflix, and put these straps on, like intermittent occlusion, and you'll get some benefit. So it basically was like, for me, it was a bit of a no-brainer because it was very low effort, but potentially with a big gain. So that's where I started with the recovery. And then I've progressed on to doing it experimenting with it on the bike and doing zone 1 intervals, things like that. But for me, it started with just strapping it on, and I could chill out really. Sometimes recovery itself feels like another trip. Like on a rest day, you really want to switch off, not have to motivate yourself to do anything. And sometimes it feels like recovery, you have to motivate yourself to do the recovery where you should be recovering your motivation. And I found that really good, like a really good modality to use, really.
So the opportunity to truly passively recover is something that you saw as a big bonus. That makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think like I do actually kind of enjoy recovery these days. I go to the ice bath and so on, I do some contrast. So like I think anything where you can, like recover without it feeling like a chore is really useful for athletes.
Out of interest, have you tried stacking yet? Those cold water?
I've tried it in the sauna, yeah.
Yeah. How was that?
It's good. I think it was good. It's hard to like when you're stacking off things. It's hard to know. But I didn't feel any worse from it. And if it's potentially another gain, then it's great.
How do you, as an athlete, measure recovery?
So I go through phases of being really on it with wearing a wearable, and then I go through phases where I just want to go off field. So now I've got the world champs in a few weeks, and like for me, I think it's a bigger risk to wake up and see I've got a terrible HRV, and it might affect my brain going into training. You know, so weirdly now is the time I would rather not use it as much. I think during training blocks it's really useful because you want to stay away from illness. You want to make sure you're sleeping and create as much adaptation as you can. Now for me it's about like protecting my confidence and going into training fully motivated to commit to efforts. So I think having something like HRV is really good in your off season and when you're away from race. But right now, I don't care about my power or anything. All I care about is like my time to complete the lap or my peak speed I hit in the kilo. So at this point of the cycle or this point of the like the year, I'm way more focused on just my performance on the track. And I think trying to put all my focus on there is what I find most beneficial.
Do you think cycling is, I think I know the answer, but it's interesting. I feel like from an outsider's point of view, we look at cycling in the same way we do F1, that it's like hyper marginal gains and it's one of the most scientific sports. But when you speak to athletes, it still does feel like there's that art versus science balance, that you're a human as well, right? And I hadn't even thought about the recovery of motivation, which I'm definitely stealing now.
Yeah.
And just how important mentally it is. And we've spoken to teams around adding BFR into large volume training blocks could reduce the amount of time needed on the bike, but actually you want that. You need those hours on the bike to build resilience and comfort in the red zone, right? So would you say you lean into one camp more than the other, or are you square in the middle? Like, is it art or science?
I think cycling has got a lot of tradition behind it. But I think if you look at like the innovators and the people that make steps in the sport, it's science driven. You see like the advent of like the amount of aerodynamic research that's gone into cycling in the last 10 years is crazy, and the times have just gone mad from that. And more recently on the road in terms of like the amount of carbs you consume, like it's kind of a new phenomenon about like how high that is. But then there's obviously massive gains to it. So I think cycling is odd because it's got so much tradition behind it. But it is also a place that's so controllable and so measurable that science obviously has a massive place.
What, in your experience, because I know you coach as well, what is harder to train, that performance output or that raw resilience that you need as a sprint cyclist?
I think I would say performance, because I think early in a career you can kind of do a lot of different training types and you'll get faster. So as a junior you can kind of throw anything at it, and as long as it's not silly you're going to progress. Where like the further into your career you get, I think you need to be more and more honed in on what you're trying to get better at. And I think that becomes the challenge is this year, which part of performance am I going to focus on? I think like resilience and sort of mental resilience kind of comes with that, because you're improving your experience and you're getting used to knowing your body, and you knowing if I wake up and I feel drained and I'm only 3 days out from racing, what am I going to do? And like previously I may have just said, I've got to train more, which obviously stupid looking back, but now it's like training less. So So I think that sort of mental resilience comes with that experience. Whereas like physical prowess, I think gets harder and harder and harder to get because you're kind of narrowing down what you've looked at before.
So you spoke really nicely there about the kind of tradition around cycling training, and I think you see that in a few sports, don't you? Like swimming and some other athletes, track and field events, for example. Looking forwards, though, we're speaking with you about research projects, and I know you're doing your own dissertation soon. If you could answer a BFR question for cycling, how would you steer that? You know, if you could answer one question for you personally, what would you love to know how to do better, or whether it works, or what would that be?
I would love the thing about track cycling is, and sprinting especially, is we train on sort of spoked wheels, normal helmet, and we race on obviously disc wheels, fast skin suit, and like a race hat. So for us, knowing about a taper is kind of everything skewed because so much stuff comes together at once. So I'd love to know how BFR could be using a taper in terms of like a minimum dose to get a signal that will hold an adaptation that you spent all season to get. Because sometimes it feels like you train all season, you taper, potentially lose some of that benefit, and you don't actually know if you've kept all of it because that's come at the same time as you putting on all the fast kit. So I think it would be great to know, like, firstly, like a BFR protocol that looks at different, like basically a protocol that can look at different things in cycling, and then from that we use that to see like a minimum dose response where you can kind of keep a signal, or you can keep your adaptation that you've worked so hard for. And I think, yeah, secondly, which kind of connected to that, is just very specific protocols in cycling. Like I know we've spoken before about like localized altitude, or as an endurance guy, or like lactate threshold or coordination losses for a sprinter, and like how we can use BFR for that. So I think if we develop some very specific protocols around that, that can then act as kind of a launch pad for lots of different things to come from.
There's a lot of that I want to talk about, one at a time. The minimum dose stuff I think is really interesting, isn't it? And I think in a point we go back to your rehab, you were doing that then, I suppose, weren't you, in a way? So, but
Yeah.
that's specificity of placing that into a taper to see how you can hang on to as much as possible while preserving freshness would obviously be incredible, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think like tapers are always a funny time because you like everyone gets a bit anxious in a taper because like it's all leading up to this one moment, and suddenly you're training less, and unless your times are suddenly way faster, then you're going to second guess it. And even if your times are faster 3 weeks out, you think, oh, still 3 weeks to go, I got to hold on to this
Too soon, yeah.
Yeah, so I think like BFR, the way that it works in terms of like it can accentuate whatever adaptation you're looking for. If you're trying to recover, it can accentuate your recovery. If you're trying to get to a point of recovery, you can limit your recovery with it. I think using that in a taper like makes massive sense because you're trying to get a stimulus, but you don't want any residual fatigue that you're going to be feeling on the line. And obviously it's going to be different for everyone, but I think if there's some sort of protocol we can get with that, it would be really useful. But yeah, as I say, it's at the moment it's a little bit tricky because so many variables change in the final month before you race. Even for us, like air conditions can change. So if air pressure drops and a week later we go way quicker, but maybe you're actually in a worse place, but the air conditions are just better. So I think it's always tricky with a taper to know. But if we could find out that, I think it'd be really useful.
This is going back to me saying that cycling's simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
To pick up on the second point that you mentioned when I asked what research would you be interested in, what did you mean by, I think you said coordination. What did you mean by that? I'm not too familiar with that.
For me, in a kilo, it's 1 minute and you're going as hard as you possibly can from the start. And usually what goes is your coordination to keep up with the pedals. So you could still push hard enough to like produce the power if it was just a single rev, but it's almost keeping up with those pedals becomes like a coordination problem rather than like a power, like a strength problem. So I think with BFR, can you get to a point where you create those, like you create the environment where you're struggling to keep up the pedals quicker, like sooner, so then you can do it repeatedly? Because at the moment, for me to sort of get that feeling, I'd have to do multiple efforts of 45 seconds in a session, which is way too much. Where can we do that within 20 seconds with BFR?
So like a pre-fatiguing type
Yeah,
protocol.
yeah.
That's really interesting. And then on that, do you think that an element of that coordination is also a cognitive demand? Or do you think it's wholly physical?
It's tricky to say. It feels physical, but then I guess you don't really know. I'm not sure. That's a tricky one.
I'm not trying to lead you down a path
No.
specifically. It's just I've been reading a few papers recently about how BFR might be able to enhance cognitive performance, which obviously for some sports could be really, really useful. And I wondered whether that coordination of movement could be linked to cognitive demand as well. But we won't try and praise BFR for everything just yet, perhaps.
I think in cycling, for my event at least, when it's very short, it's probably just a physical thing because I've emptied myself in that time. But in like a track event like the Madison, where you're looking for your partner all the time, you're calculating scores, points, sorry, and you're doing a lot of things in your head at the same time as you're on the rivet. Like maybe there's a place. I think in kilo, I think as sprinters, we're not known to be like clever. I think we just close our eyes like a Neanderthal and go for it. So I think it's more physical for me. But yeah, maybe there's a place for that in the Madison or events where you're calculating as you go.
I want to go back to you having that as cyclists, and I'd say maybe it's similar in running as well, where you have long periods of no competition, then a lot of pressure on competition. So when we have worked as a company with team sports who have a really congested season, loads of competitions, there's loads of opportunities to try things, and there's less pressure on return of investment of trying something new. I guess for you, there's a lot of pressure to try a new technology, new innovation, new intervention, because if you screw up that training block, you might have to wait 6 to 9 months before the next opportunity to see if that did affect the competition or it was something else. So what is it that goes into you as an athlete, and maybe again as your other role as a coach, what do you need to see or need to feel about something before trying it out either on yourself or with other athletes?
Yeah, that's tricky. For me, it was like trying like a different training modality, like in terms of going from P3 to P1 in kilo. That kind of came from a place of necessity because I was trying to get in the Olympic team, and that was like the spot. So I kind of had to close my eyes and throw everything at it. But I think it's tricky. I think you've got. I think if you see other people doing it, it works. That's obviously a massive motivator. So I saw, for me, using BFR startup, it came from my physio who I trusted a lot, and I really trust their opinion. So I kind of jumped on that straight away. But I do think it is tricky to kind of be the first to try something. So I guess it comes from case studies and data that you can look into. But to nail it on one, it's probably I'm not really sure. Sorry, I can't really think.
We spoke before. No, it's fine. We spoke before about how art versus science of cycling, and the marginal gains of coming from aerodynamics and lighter products. Do you think that success is going to come from people trying more new things, or is it going to be just innovating those old traditions that you've been talking about as well?
It's got to be trying new things. I think if you look at track cycling in the last 20 years, like the speeds have gone so much quicker. Firstly, from aerodynamics, which has been massively taken on, but also in just training with bigger gears. So we now race and train on huge gears compared to so Chris Hoy would have raced on a gear that's 25% smaller than the gears people are racing on today.
Lightweight.
Yeah. I think that came from like a trial and error experimentation, I think, from the French. So I think there's always going to be, you've got to throw new things at it to kind of see big shifts, because humans aren't becoming better. Humans aren't becoming better humans. It's like things that go into that, the training and the technology that people give a shot or give a chance to, and they sort of run with it, and it seems to work. I'm sure there'll be things that people have tried that haven't worked. But something as simple as the example of gears in track cycling, so simple. Like you would have thought people would have thought about that 50 years ago, but it was never really given the time to try. And I think it's the similar with road guys and the gym. I think almost all of them now are in the gym, and obviously it took quite a while for people to adopt that. And now it's kind of there, and people are realizing, and it just becomes part of training. So I think it probably starts off with an idea, then you've got to commit to the idea rather than just doing it a little bit.
So speaking of ideas, we spoke about how you like a bit of self-experimentation. You obviously got some massive competitions coming up. Do you have anything on your shortlist of experiments for post the Worlds? So specifically talking with BFR, have you thought about how you might integrate it in different ways to what you are now?
Yeah, so I'd like to know more. Well, I'd like to use it on the bike more. So I've used it previously with occluded rest intervals between sprints. And that's been more of just a trial, just to see how it feels and see how it would affect fatigue. But I think post Worlds, I think there's going to be a big place for that in my plan, because I'm going to go into like an off season of like heavy strength work, and that's going to be like a big goal for me, is basically increase thigh girth and increase max force output. But alongside that, I've seen the benefits of working in like a lactate space or working with BFR on the bike, and I want that to be. I don't want to lose those benefits that I've tried so hard over the last 6 months to get. So I think using that alongside the gym is something I'm definitely looking forward to doing.
Is cycling a sport, because it's such marginal gains and it's team, but not really, right? It's individual athletes. Is it a sport where there's a lot of gatekeeping, or is there a lot of sharing of information, best practices, innovations between teams, athletes, coaches, setups?
I think there is quite a lot of gatekeeping, yeah. Because for me, we race as nations mostly. So like, unless you have, a coach that goes to work with one nation and comes to you, it's very, very tricky to know. And I know, like in the past, we've been told not to put things on Instagram, like isometric training. I think we were probably one of the first teams that really, really did a lot of that. And then someone posted on Instagram, and then suddenly see the Canadians are doing it. And then, so it's like, I think there is quite a lot of gatekeeping. But I feel like it's getting more and more open, to be honest. I think everyone trains in a very, broadly, everyone trains in quite a similar way. But I think it's those small things. When the margins are so small, like you say, it's like tiny little changes you make to training that do make the difference. Like first to fifth might be separated by 1/10 and a half of a second, which like is obviously so small. So I think although the bulk of what we do is very similar, I think making small changes can have a big impact in your results. So I think that's probably where the gatekeeping does come from.
So we're sharing what you can share. Is there anything that you would kind of, looking back now, give advice or technique or suggest you'd give to younger cyclists that, like, so the learning curve isn't quite as long?
I would say it's not even like a small thing, but just as a principle, I think it took me so long to realize that you make your gains when you're recovering. And I know it's like such a common thing that people say now, but I used to think like time I wasn't training was kind of wasted time. And like now it's about getting that stimulus and then recovering from that stimulus. And like, I kind of kick myself when I look back, because I didn't really appreciate that at all. Where to young riders, it'd just be that, yeah, get your training done, get as good of a stimulus as you can, and then recover, like ready for your next session, basically. I know it's probably not a sound bite and it sounds pretty simple, but it really is useful.
I think this shows the value of great coaches, especially with young athletes. And like, I'm a sucker for a quote, or when there's things you said today that I'm going to take and pass off as my own. But there's and again, this might be common thread, but I think when you have great coaches and setups that break things down in memorable ways, it sticks with athletes, and they take it everywhere and they apply it to everything. And there's a team up in Sunderland called Martin Nugent that work with some really great elite academy kids. And one of the coaches there says, you can only train as well as you recover. And he doesn't say it flippantly. He's just like, yeah, like, cool, you did all this stuff in the gym, but it means nothing if you then go home and, go out on the beers or don't eat or don't sleep. So like he said, it doesn't matter what you want to do in life, you're only going to train or perform. Actually, the benchmark isn't did you score the goals? The benchmark is how well did you recover? Because that will dictate how well you perform. And I just think when you get coaches that break stuff down like that, and like the advice you'd give yourself now, you go, everyone knows that you need to recover. Like, yeah. Maybe not. Maybe there are coaches not saying that. There's coaches saying train harder if you want to make this top 1%.
Yeah. And it's like you focus so much on the work you do, like you go into training, you like fully fired up for a session, and if you go home and then you're not recovering, you're not getting everything out of that session. So you owe it to yourself to really recover well. And I think as a younger athlete, I really didn't appreciate that at all. I would just think my job is to go to the track, train, and when I'm at home, that's just like job done. But that's not really job done. So it can lead to a bit of a boring existence when you're in the race period. You know, you're just staying in the recovery. But it does really make the difference. And that's where like technology and things like Hytro come in, because if you've got those basics nailed, like at the top level, a lot of people have nailed those basics, but there's a lot of other untapped potential you can get to get the edge. But I think as a young athlete, you just want to, you know, get those basics done and get your training done and recover as well as you possibly can. That's why BFR is so great, because you can like make the stimulus potentially bigger, or you get the stimulus with less load, and then you can recover better with it too. So I think, yeah, there's a place for it in young athletes as well.
So really appreciate your time. I'm going to ask one more question of you that we ask all the guests, and that is, knowing what you do know now, and you've got a wealth of ways to look at your sport and performance. In your mind, what makes a difference between a good and a great athlete?
I think looking at the bigger picture is a really big one. Like, it's in cycling, like you obviously don't race much, and it can be really easy to get caught up in like small like setbacks in training. But you kind of look at the bigger picture, and it leads to consistency, it leads to good training over time, and it kind of lets you work on building towards something bigger. I think for me, earlier in my career, I maybe struggled a little bit with worrying about the next thing and not really looking at the bigger picture, and maybe like cut your nose off to spite your face in terms of a gain which is going to help you long term, but it's not going to help the training session after. And I think all the really, really top guys, I think bad sessions they write off and they look forward. So I'd probably put it down to that. But I think like it's physical, mental, and it's kind of looking into technology and things like that as well. So it's basically the full package. But I think at the top level, a lot of those guys have it. But I think the guys that are able to switch off and look forward is a massive one.
Good advice for life as much as it is for pro sport. So yeah, I appreciate that. Joe, thank you so much. It's been really insightful. This is not going to be the last time that you are on doing this with us. And yeah, as Tom alluded to, I think there's a lot of work for us to do to look at cycling specific, but beyond that, as far as research and product. So for the Hytro community, this is just the start of all the Joe Truman we're going to be serving you. So just want to say thanks again, Joe. Really appreciate your insight, appreciate your honesty. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for listening.
Cheers, guys.